Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Dalid Amid Aleph, starting with Daf Gimel Amid Beis Halacha Dalid, the new Mishnah. Our Mishnah speaks about those who are potter from giving Machzis HaShekel. If they choose to give Machzis HaShekel, do we accept that Machzis HaShekel as a donation or not? Says the Mishnah, Afal Pisha Omru Ein Memashkenin Noshim Va'avodim Viktanim Aval Im Shoklu Mekabli Miyodam. Even though we do not force a collection from the Noshim, Avodim and Ketanim, but if they choose to go ahead and give a Machzis HaShekel donation, we will accept it. In contrast, says the Mishnah, Hanochri Vehakuti Sheshoklu Ein Mekabli Mehem. If the Nachri or the Kuti are those who were brought by the king Ashur from Kuta to live in Eretz Yisrael, specifically in the area of the Shomron, and they were not Yirei Shomayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent indeed lions to devour them, and they ultimately converted. There's a machlokes, we'll soon see whether that conversion was a true conversion or because out of fear instead. Here it states, however, that the Nachri and the Kuti who do choose to give a Machzis HaShekel donation, we will not accept it, since the Machzis HaShekel donation goes towards the buying of the korbanos that are tzibur, or korban tzibur, is not something that they can partake in, and therefore they can't give to such a korban, whereby we don't accept the Machzis HaShekel from them. The Mishnah goes on to say, "Ve'ein mekabim miyodam kinei zovim v'kinei zovois v'kinei yoldois." We also don't accept them the various what called kinei. Kinei over here refers to the nest. Literally, it's a pair of birds. When it comes to the zovim, a male who saw what seems to be similar to shichva zera, but it's not the same. He sees 3 days in a row, so he's required to see 7 clean days. Then bitoivel in a mayan, in a spring, natural spring source, and then bring a pair of birds as a korban, one for a chatos, one for an oila. And so therefore it's referring to the kinei of the zovim. The kinei zovas is similar. A woman who sees from oisoi mokoim, not during her menstruation, and she sees also 3 times, she also has to count 7 clean days, then bitoivel, and also bring a pair of birds, a chatas and a oila. And finally, the kinei yoldois, here it's referring to a woman who gave birth. If it's a zachar, a male, then she is tameh for a period of 1 week, 7 days, and then she can be toiva and she's mutter to her husband. If it's a nekeva, then it's double the time, it's 14 days, and then she's toiva and she's mutter to her husband. Then the woman who gave birth, if it's a male, she has to wait 33 days to bring then korbanos. And if it's a female, double the time, 66 days. Al kopanim, that also, if she doesn't have the means to bring a kevesh, she also brings two birds. And these are not something that certainly the Nachri, but even the Kuti can then go ahead and give. The Mishnah goes on to say, V'chatos v'ashamois. These are obligatory korbanos. A chatos is required for somebody who, if he did it b'mezi, to be chayiv kares. So therefore, when he does b'shoigeg, he's chayiv a korban chatos. Or an osham, for a person who stole and he denied stealing and he took a shvua, these korbanos cannot be accepted by the kuti or the nachri. The Mishnah brings a klal zeh klal, kol shenider v'nidev mekablim miyodon, kol she'eno nider v'nidev ein mekablim miyodon. However, if it's a neder or a nedava, korbanos that are voluntary, for example, a korban oila or a korban shlomim, a neder says hare that the korban is alai, or a nedava that it's hare zu korban, referring to a certain animal. Al kopanim, these could yes be accepted by the nachri and the kuti. The Mishnah goes on and supports this. V'chei mefurash al yedei Ezra. This is also explicitly stated by Ezra in the book of Ezra. Shneimar, it states, Lo lochem velonu livnois bayis lehelokenu. The Kutim wanted to then also give towards the Beis Hamikdash, the building of the second Beis Hamikdash, and they were told, no, we won't accept your donations for the building of the Beis Hamikdash. It's only for us to build. On top of Dalet Amud Aleph, by the way, that equally applies, of course, to the Nachrim as well, even though it was spoken to the Kutim. On top of Dalet Amud Aleph, the Mishnah goes on to say that when it comes to giving Machzis HaShekel in certain instances, one might have to compensate that maybe the Machzis HaShekel is not the sufficient weight, whereby he has to be compensate by adding what's called a kalboin, a certain measurement of a certain coin that is added to then compensate for the lack of the Machzis HaShekel. The Mishnah at the very end will discuss the weight of this kalboin. Al Kapani, the Mishnah says, Ve'elu shaychayavim bekalbon. The following are obligated to add the kalbon coin. Levim, v'Yisrael, v'Geirim, v'Avodim, v'Shuchrorim. All of these that are themselves obligated in the Machzis HaShekel, they have to also add the kalbon. Avoloi kohanim, but not kohanim. Although kohanim are obligated in the Machzis HaShekel, but since we cannot memashkenin the kohanim, therefore they're also not obligated in the kalbon. V'noshim v'avodim v'ktanim. They themselves are also not obligated, and therefore they're not chayiv, certainly in the kalbon. Hashoykil ayidei kohen, ayidei ha'isha, ayidei eved, ayidei katan potter. If somebody gives on behalf of any one of these, a kohen, an isha, an eved, or a katan, he does not have to add a kalbon. It's only when you're giving for your own Machzis HaShekel. Ve'im shokal al yodoi ve'ayidei chaveroi chay bekalbon echod. Here the Tanna Kama does not require a person to take a kalbon for a half a shekel that he gives. His opinion is, since it states in the Torah to give a chat Machzis HaShekel, there's no such requirement to add any amount above that. However, here we're talking about where he gives a full shekel, half going towards himself and half going towards his friend. Since he has to break up the shekel itself, that he does have to add a kalbon. Rabbi Meir Omer Beis kalbonis, but Rabbi Meir says he'd have to give two: one for breaking up the shekel, the full shekel, but a second one for the kalbon for himself. Hanoisein sela v'noitel shekel chayiv shtei kalbonos. Here, even the Tanna Kama agrees. Here we're talking about where he takes a full shekel, that's what a sela is, and he has to then give a half a shekel. From that he gets half a shekel change. Since over here he'd have to break up a full shekel, so that's one kalbon, and a second one, since the chetzi shekel he gets back, maybe indeed it's going to be more than what he really deserves, whereby it'll probably be a problem of me'ilah. So here he'd have to give a second kalbon to compensate that he's not getting more than really he deserves. Hashoykil al yidei oni v'ayidei shechenoi v'ayad ben iroi potter. One who then gives a Machzis HaShekel for an ani, for a shochen, for a ben iro is potter. Here we have lo zu af zu style. That means not only in ani, if a person will give a Machzis HaShekel, will then he be potter from the kalboin, but even, which is tzedakah, but even when he gives to a shochen, not tzedakah, here he has a nice relationship with the shochen. And not only when he gives a shochen will he be potter from adding the kalboin, but even from a ben iro, he doesn't have the same shaykhis to, even that would be also a petur in giving a kalboin. V'im hilvin chayev. However, if he lends them, in other words, he gives a shekel a Machzis shekel on behalf of one of these people, an ani, a shochen, a ben iroi, but with the intention that they're going to pay him back, it's just a halva, then he would have to then add a kalbon, and then when they pay him back, they'll add a kalbon to pay him back. The Mishnah talks about ha'achin hashutfin shechayavim bekalbon ptur b'maiser behema. Here we're talking about achim who already made then a chalukah on the Yerusha between the brothers, and afterwards they became shutfin in the nechasim. So like they're like regular shutfim, whereby they're going to be potter, they're going to chayiv in a kalboin, like any other shutfin, but they'll be potter from meiser. Meiser, if there's a shutfus, meiser means one out of every 10 animals is then is kodesh, is offered as a korban, and the meat is eaten as kachim kalim by the bailim. And if it's shutfim, there's no requirement to then give meiser behema. However, if they did not yet make a chalukah between the father's Yerusha, so then it's really as if the father himself is now giving the machzis hashekel. So even though they're doing it, but it's from his nechasim, whereby it's not going to be a shutfis, therefore be chayiv in meiser behema. However, they will be potter from the kalboin, because the father is giving on their behalf. The Kamahu Kalbo. Now the Mishnah concludes by saying, what is the measurement, what is the weight of this Kalboin that one has to add in certain circumstances? Ma Kesef Divrei Meir. Rameir says it's a Ma Kesef, which comes out to be, it's going to be 1/12. 1/12 is going to be the measurement according to Rabbi Meir. V'chacham moimrim, in other words, 1/12 means just as the Masechet Shekel would be, let's say, 12. So a ma is going to be 1/12 of that amount. He's going to have 1/12 of the Chatzis Masechet Shekel according to Rabbi Meir. V'chol marmrim Chatzi ma. They say it's going to be half a ma, whereby it will be 1/24 of the amount of the Masechet HaShekel. Ask the Gemara, Afal Pi Sha'amru V'chule. Here, the Mishnah that's being quoted is referring to the Ketanim, even though when it comes to the Ketanim, they're not obligated in Masechet HaShekel and we cannot mashkin in them. However, if they give, we will then accept the Masechet HaShekel. Says the Gemara with the following diuk. Omar Rabbi Bo, the Gemara asked the diuk, Halitvoya in Halitvoya ein toivin. The diuk is that only if the Ketanim will give the Masechet HaShekel, we will accept it. But if we cannot demand it, we can't be Toveya, the Masechet HaShekel. Ask the Gemara, Hacha at Amar Omar Toivin, V'hacha at Amar Ein Toivin. In the previous Mishnah, we said that we can, yes, be Toveya, the Katan, for the Masechet HaShekel, and yet over here we're saying not. Answers the Gemara, Kan Kishehevi Beis Sairos, V'kan B'Shelo Hevi Beis Sairos. The first Mishnah is talking about when the katan was sprouted already 2 sairos after the age of 13, whereby we can even be toivin the machzis hashekel. But over here in this Mishnah, the deal that we're making, you cannot be toiveya, is because he did not yet have shtei sairos. In regards to nashim and avodim, they themselves, you cannot be toivin, they're not obligated in machzis hashekel. Hanochri va'akuti v'chulei. The Gemara says the following: Omer Rabba. We have the following, says Rabba, Tipoter, there's a machlokes, and he says you can then solve the machlokes. Keman da'amar kuti benochri, kenochri, that like the opinion that says the kuti is like a nochri. In other words, the conversion that the kuti made was a forced conversion because of the fear to be devoured by the lions, and therefore it's not a valid conversion. And you can prove from our Mishnah the fact that it says that you cannot accept their machzis hashekel, it must be they're not really gerim. Because if they were gerim, you could accept it. So that's Rabbo's explanation of our Mishnah. And he explains this how the isplagin, because we have a machlokes, what is a kuti, is a geri emes or not? Kuti kenochri divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says it is like a nochri. It's a forced conversion. It's not a valid conversion. Rebbe Shimon Gamliel oimer kuti ki Yisrael lekol davar, like a regular ger. And therefore, Rabbo comes to explain that our Mishnah seems to go like Rebbe, that indeed it's a forced conversion because we cannot accept the machzis hashekel from the kuti. Rebbe Lozar masnisim benochrim. Ha-bekutim loi. Rav Lozar says that the Mishnah is talking about nochrim, but not kutim. So when it says, indeed, that you cannot go ahead and accept the machzis hashekel, it's talking about from the nochrim, not from the kutim. V'tani kain, we have a brisa that supports this, says Rav Lozar. Adam. The pasuk says, Adam in regards to the korbanos, it says, l'rabois, the korban oila. L'rabois is our gerim. You can go ahead and include the gerim. It says, mikem lohoitzi es hamumorim. However, mikem comes to exclude mumorim. So you see that gerim can indeed be included in the korbanos. The Gemara asks, masnisa pligi al Rabbi Elazar. However, the Brisa comes in to contradict what Rabbi Elazar is saying. Rabbi Elazar wants to say that from here, that we can say that's not talking about kutim, it's talking about nachrim, not to accept the karbonos. However, says the Gemara, we have a brisa that seems to contradict what he's saying, as follows: Ein mekablim miyadam kine zavim v'kine zavois v'kine yoldois. I'm sorry, it's our Mishnah that contradicts it, because our Mishnah says you cannot accept from the kutim and the nachrim, not kine zavin, kine zavos, or kine yoldois. V'chiyesh kine zavin zavois benachrim. Is there such a thing, a concept of these offerings for nachrim? We're talking about the tuma of zavin and zavois and yoldois, which is not shaykh to nachrim. So it must be that we're talking about kutim. So here it does say that we don't accept these karbonos from the kutim. Gemara says Ella, then it would come out reisha benachim v'seifa bekutim. It would come out then that you're then saying that the reisha is talking about nachrim and the seifa would be talking about kutim, and that would be difficult. Gemara says no. Kainhu. You can even explain it. Reisha benachim v'seifa bekutim. You can say that the reisha was talking about nachrim, as Rabbi Elazar wanted to say, and the seifa is talking about kutim. Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, in regards to giving the nachrim, giving towards the Beis Hamikdash, in the beginning when they gave towards the Beis Hamikdash, we would not accept their donations. Lo davar mesuyam, v'lo davar she'eino mesuyam, not something that was distinct or something that was not distinct. V'soif mekablin mehen davar she'eino mesuyam, ve'ein mekablin mehen davar mesuyam. At the end, we did accept things that were not mesuyam, but not things that were mesuyam. In other words, even after the building of Beis Hamikdash, in terms of then the support for the bedek habayis, the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash, we would only accept, says Rabbi Yochanan, that which was not going to be mesuyam, because something that's mesuyam, they can point to it, something that's distinct, and say, oh, we gave that, and that would be then them saying that they give something specific to the Beis Hamikdash, which would not be something that we would want them to do, to have such a way of expressing that the object that they can point to belongs to that, was ultimately their donation. Al Kopani, Rabbi Yochanan says that in the beginning we didn't accept any donation. That means for the building of the Beis Hamikdash. But when it came to Bedek Habayis, at the end, afterwards, when it was already built, we did accept those davar that were not mesuyam. Rabbi Shimon Lakish Omar, Bein Betchila, Bein Besoif, Ein Mekablim Mehen, Lo davar mesuyam, Lo davar she'ein mesuyam. Rabbi Lakish argues and says that we never, not only in the beginning, but even after, in terms of the Bedek Habayis, would we accept any type of donation from the Nachrim to then even give an upkeep for the bias. Says the Gemara, Masnisa Pligi al Rabbi Yochanan. We have a brisa that argues on which Rabbi Yochanan said. Again, Rabbi Yochanan said ultimately, after the building of the Beis Hamikdash, for the Bedek HaBayis, we accepted their donation of Davar She'eino Mesuyim. Asked the Gemara from the following brisa, Ein mekablim mehen hekdesh v'nedava lebedek habayis. Here it says, without distinction, that we don't accept from the nachri the hekdesh or the nedava for the bedek habayis. And Rabbi Yochanan again said that we would accept it if it's something that's not mesuyim. And here the brisa does not distinguish. Answers the Gemara, Psor la bein betchila bein basoif ubilva davar mesuyam. You can answer and explain the brisa is talking about a davar mesuyam, that we don't accept it not in the beginning in terms of the building, and not for the bedek habayis at the end if it's a davar mesuyam. So that's miyuhashev the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Now ask the Gemara, turning to Rabbi Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Omar, Bein bat chila, bein basoif, ein mekamehem loy davar mesuyam, and even a davar she'eino mesuyam. Ask the Gemara, Masnisa Paliga, al Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. We have a brisa that argues on what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says. Again, he's saying that nothing was accepted even after for the bedek habayis, whether it's a davar mesuyam or davar she'eino mesuyam. The Tani, for it says in the brisa, Hakol shavin shehei noidrin v'nidorin. It says that everybody agrees that when it comes to the Nachri as being noider, for the Bedek HaBayis we understand, or a subject of being noider, then is accepted. In other words, when one says that I will give to the Bedek HaBayis the value of the marketplace for such a Nachri, or the Nachri were to determine, one would say that, or the Nachi would be noider rather, also that he would give to the Beis Hamikdash Bedek HaBayis for his value on the marketplace. In either situation, whether he is the one who's noider or he's the subject of the neder, then everybody agrees that's valid. So not like Reish Lakish, who says you can never allow the Nachri to give to Bedek HaBayis. Answers the Gemara, Psar la oila. We're not talking about a neder of Bedek HaBayis, but rather a neder of a carbon oil of an animal. The Gemara says, Nicha noidrin oila, but nidrin oila. In other words, it would be very well about a Nachri who would say, I'm going to then obligate myself a neder to give a carbon. But to say that he's an object, to say that a Jew can go ahead and say that I'm going to obligate him a carbon for a neder, that certainly is not something that would be feasible. Why would he listen and accept such a neder? Elo, says the Gemara, it's not a kasha. Kisha Omar Yisrael, Harei Olai Oila. When the Bar Yisrael says, it's upon me a carbon oila, the Shoma Nachri, and the Nachri overheard him saying that. V'Omar, and he says, Masha Omar Ze Olai. What he said is upon me. I'm going to take over that neder that he made for himself. It'll be upon me. I will then be required to bring that as a neder. That is what's referring to over here as nidorin, and therefore it's not a kasha on Reish Lakish, because when it says over here that everybody agrees shehein noidin v'nidorin, it's talking about a carbon oila.